Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about movements and initiatives that seek to move humanity to its next epochal iteration. This podcast is brought to you by Whitlingo. When it comes to managing a community, one of the keys to success is the ability to effectively communicate with the members of that community. If you are a service coordinator or responsible for community engagement, Whitlingo provides a multi-channel, multilingual notification and engagement platform to help you work more efficiently and effectively. For more information, please visit www.whitlingo.com. That's www.whitlingo.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid.
Dr. Sarah Lee Whitson, Professor Mohammad Fadel, thank you so much for making the time. You guys are very, very busy in these crazy times. So I appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak with you.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so just so that you guys know, this is the first time I'm recording since November of 2023. Usually I did one of these every week or two, right? And then I just stopped completely since then for obvious reasons, right? At least to us here. I've been consumed by what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, trying to help in any way that I can. And so I'm rebooting, so to speak, with the right thing to focus on, given that this is what I'm focusing on in my life other than my professional work. So let me start with this basic question. Why is it taking so long for the genocide to stop? It has been on almost 8 months and everybody has been rebelling and so forth, and yet it continues. Why has it not stopped?
The answer, I think, is quite obvious. It hasn't stopped because Israel doesn't want to stop. Israel wants to keep fighting this war in Gaza. Israel, for domestic political reasons, wants to pretend that this is a war that must continue against Hamas. It's a very effective distraction from Netanyahu's own problems. And the United States is willing to ensure that nobody makes Israel stop its genocidal atrocities in Gaza. So you have a combination of a belligerent extremist government that has the backing and military support of the world's richest, most powerful country, that is assembling to ensure that the war and the slaughter doesn't stop.
And if I could just add a couple of points to that. I mean, I'm wholly in agreement with what Sarah said, except I would say this is not a war against Hamas, it's a war against Palestinians and a war against the very idea of Palestine. And this is possible not only because Zionism is virulently anti-Palestinian, but so is, as far as I can tell, much of the US foreign policy elite. And I think the real question that we should ask ourselves is, why is the US foreign policy elite so virulently anti-Palestinian? One can understand why Zionists are, because it's kind of a necessary concomitant of their ideology. But the cost of anti-Palestinianism to Americans standing in the world is huge. And so it's a real puzzle that it persists.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I started with that question, because I continue to be puzzled. I'm trying to figure out a way to explain this in my head. I totally understand and I get what you both have said. But the cost, for example, let's just focus on the cost to Biden in his re-election push, right? Clearly, this is not helping him and will not help him, and he will probably lose the election because of this, among other, obviously, reasons, right? So I am puzzled that he and his administration continues heedless on this, knowing that this is hurting them. And so I'm puzzled in that sense. Let me ask you as a follow-up, did you think, knowing what you know, what you knew then, did you think that it was going to last this long? Because I didn't. Mohammed, did you think that it was going to last this long?
Well, I never had any expectations for it to end, largely because it's obvious that Israel has no political strategy. And so when you have no political strategy, the only thing you can do is kill, 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 and kill again. And so there's no logical terminus to Israeli policy other than genocide.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the reality of it, because there is no political strategy. Israel is incapable of coming to a political settlement with Palestinians. It is ideologically incapable of doing so, any more than slave owners were capable of coming to a political settlement with their slaves. So Israel cannot come to a political settlement with Palestinians. So it has a choice either to sort of engage in permanent occupation, subordination, which is inherently unstable, or get rid of them one way or the other.
Right. But if the reason why, so for me, I thought by January it would stop because election season would kick off. Usually, presidentials, they start really with the primaries and so on. I said, the United States, without whose help financially and politically, Israel cannot do anything, will put its foot down and say, okay, you've punished enough. Now let's move into a phase of the usual, right? Let's have some talks, let's have some negotiations, just delay, so that the slaughter stops and images stop and things calm down. And so I am astonished that has not happened. Again, looking at it and thinking, because I believe, maybe I'm wrong, right? I believe that the dog that wags the tail is the U.S. and that Israel is a tail. I may be wrong, but I think if the United States decided that they need to stop, Israel would stop. We've seen examples of when the United States puts its foot down, Israel complies. But Sarah, am I naive in being puzzled like this? Do I need to figure out more what's happening? Is it more complicated than I think? What's going on if I come from the angle of Biden is putting himself politically, and it's puzzling that he hasn't put his foot down. Is my puzzlement unjustified?
Well, I suppose it is. I mean, if you start with the premise that the Biden administration has very much wanted Israel to wrap up this war, has very much wanted Israel to stop hindering the delivery of aid, including American aid, has wanted Israel to stop killing journalists and international aid workers. But Israel has repeatedly rebuffed it and snubbed it and said no. The challenge is that the Biden administration itself is not acting independently or as an executive with respect to U.S. policy or with respect to America's support for Israel. The Biden administration is under tremendous pressure from a class of billionaire donors who make up his biggest donors, who anytime he tries to act critically with respect to Israel, anytime he tries to impose some measure of pressure on him, immediately these donors come after him. And Israel is now basically deploying its supporters to attack Biden. And the Republicans are deploying attacks on Biden for any measure to rein in Israel, even a fraction of an inch. And in fact, the pro-Israel community is so apoplectic that the Biden administration has done even the tiniest wrist slaps on Israel, that they're trying to push legislation that will basically take U.S. military support for Israel completely out of the hands of the executive branch, out of the hands of the presidency, and legislate it as a matter of law to say that no president can stop aid to Israel. So unfortunately, I think it shows the extent to which wealthy, powerful donors what they say, what they want, counts more than what even the president of the United States might think is in the American interest, or what the American people want, which is an end to this war. And that, I think, is a dirty underbelly of American politics that has come to very clear and naked visibility now at this moment with respect to the war in Gaza.
If I could sort of add on to that, again, I think everything Sarah said is totally correct. But I would also add, I genuinely believe there is an ideological commitment among very important players in the US political system to a genocide of the Palestinians. I mean, the Republican Party is clearly a pro-genocide party. They don't view Palestinians as human beings. Several Republican politicians have basically made genocidal statements. And so I think they're perfectly happy seeing every Palestinian killed on the Republican side. I don't think that causes a problem for them at all. Secondly, I think if you recall the incident earlier in the fall with the former Obama administration official in New York, where he was harassing that hot dog vendor, there's a great deal of profoundly internalized anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Palestinian sentiment in the foreign policy elite of the United States themselves. So, of course, we've had prominent resignations like Josh Paul, but one of the results of the war on terror, I think, has been essentially creation of an entrenched bloc of foreign policy elites with an ideological, hatred is maybe a strong word, but something approaching hatred of Palestinians, because they're viewed as the obstacle to Americans achieving their aims in the world. If the Palestinians would just disappear, then we could actually claim to have, some sort of rule of law system. But the problem is Israel, from its inception until today, is an exception to every principle of international law. And instead of having the political will to discipline Israel, they want to eliminate the Palestinians.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let me add my 2 cents here, and then I will go to the next question. My 2 cents are the following. I believe that, again, I go back to my metaphor, who's the dog and who's the tail. I believe that the dog is the United States. The United States thinks about its global position in the world. It had a plan starting in 2000, with the Bush administration, of basically destabilizing, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and so on, Yemen, and the only one left is Iran. And I see them using Iran as a way to just keep in a state of, in instability. And I believe that the political system is another tale for the folks who are running the show, the folks who are, and so on and so forth. Those guys continue to work with the model of we need to ensure that that we are in charge of countries that are strategic, right? In charge, for example, of Ukraine, in charge of Saudi Arabia, we're in charge of that whole Middle East region, right? And so I see Israel really as, because it continues to puzzle me, donors or no donors. We saw how, what's her name? Hillary Clinton, with all those donors, lost the election in 2016. So money is a tool, and Biden continues to focus on the money. Are they thinking that money is going to buy you a re-election while alienating your base, your core base, in so many ways? It looks like they're going out of their way to lose, to be honest with you, right? So I'm in this position where I continue to be puzzled, because I don't believe that the donors are that influential. I mean, they give money, but this campaign should understand that no money can buy you, nobody can buy you your base if your base is outraged, that they will not come out to vote. And the Democratic Party, again and again, they lose when a certain percentage of the black votes doesn't show up. I mean, if you see it systematically, When you outrage the a sliver of your base, you will lose. That's why Hillary lost. That's why Kerry lost. That's why Gore lost, because they didn't focus. They thought that they could buy their election, the presidency. Anyway, so those are my 2 cents, sort of my paradigm of seeing things in that way. But let me take a step back and let's talk about Dawn. And I have a couple of questions that, the reason why I asked you both is because you are very interesting characters in the following sense. Both of you came from careers that would have been extremely lucrative, and yet you decided to take, I'm going to call it the human rights turn, right? So I'll start with you, Sarah, because you were at Goldman Sachs, right? And you went from Goldman Sachs to Human Rights Watch. That's very rare. And sort of it gives me hope that there are people who go through the system, let's call it, and then figure out a way that, or have a conscience enough to actually make such such a drastic turn. So maybe you can tell me the story, and I want the same story from Mohammad, because you also were working at this law firm and all that, making a lot of good money, and you decided that that's not where you want to be. You want to be in academia. So I just wanted to just take that step back. Tell me a little bit about Dawn, and then tell me about your that human rights an academic turn that you guys took. I'll start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So Dawn is an organization that was founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi. It was his brainchild to have an organization that would work to promote democracy in the Middle East. We focus on reforming U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and ending U.S. support for abusive regimes in the Middle East. And so we focus specifically on the governments that the United States has the closest ties to in the region, which are, of course, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And Jordan, of course, which is now the second largest recipient of U.S. military assistance. We work to hold abusive officials accountable from these countries using U.S. law and international law mechanisms. We work to hold the enablers of these regimes, namely their U.S. lobbyists, accountable. And we are trying to reform the system that allows these governments, these foreign dictatorships, to have such massive influence within our own political system here in the United States. Because what we have come to realize is this is not just about promoting democracy or ending support for tyranny in the Middle East. We are now at a stage where we're trying to preserve and protect the democratic integrity of our own country, because it has increasingly come under foreign influence in ways that are very detrimental to America's own national interests and credibility and global standing.
Give me an example. I'm sorry. Give me an example before you go on of an action, of something concrete you guys do, so that people can sort of visualize.
Well, we have filed over 45 submissions to the International Criminal Court about individual Israeli officials, commanders, officers who we believe are responsible for the ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity underway in Gaza. We've submitted individual profiles on these people. We have submitted requests for the U.S. government to impose sanctions under the Leahy Law and under Magnitsky Act, as well as treasury sanctions against Saudi officials, Egyptian officials, Israeli officials. And recently, the U.S. government has, in the slap on the wrist category, sanctioned some of the individuals and entities that we have documented the abuses they've carried out. So that has been a sort of a more tactile, practical effort undertaking that we've made. we are really seeking writ large the enforcement of existing US laws. And so we do a lot of political lobbying and advocacy to achieve that.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, let's now talk about how come you went from the dark world to the light world, if you want, if I may call it like that. Tell me about what prompted you to make that switch.
Yeah, I mean, even when I was in the private sector and working in investment banking, and before that in big law, corporate law, I've always maintained my involvement in human rights work, particularly human rights work in the Middle East. And I served as general counsel for an organization called the Center for Economic and Social Rights for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years while I was in the private sector. So I kind of always had one foot in the human rights world. But when the second Gulf War started, when the United States was preparing to invade Iraq, and ultimately did invade Iraq for a second time on completely false pretenses based on massive lies to the American people, I realized that that was what mattered to me and that was what I cared about. And that's where I wanted to spend more of my time working. So a job came open at Human Rights Watch and I decided to make the switch. I decided that I didn't want to do this sort of work part-time anymore. I wanted to do it full-time. And yeah, of course, it was a tremendously difficult decision in terms of the financial losses, like a 90% salary cut, and so forth. But so far, no regrets. I mean, I feel at least that I have the privilege of working on things I care about and that matter to me, and that I believe are, an effort to make a contribution to the world we live in now. And my own sort of personal philosophical views are such that it's something I want to be directly involved in and directly working on.
Thank you for that. Professor Fadel, you were at Sullivan and Cromwell, and again, I think you were making a whole lot of money then as a professor of law in the University of Toronto. You're a graduate of the University of Chicago. So tell me, probably similar lines, but tell me your story in terms of why did you decide to go into teaching and away from practicing law with a big firm?
Well, I went to law school after I did my PhD at the University of Chicago. And I viewed law school as a kind of a postdoc because I'd written my dissertation in Islamic legal history, but I'd never had any formal training in law school. And so I viewed law school as my opportunity to become a much better scholar. I never thought of myself as entering into the world of private practice law, much less becoming a Wall Street lawyer. So that happened kind of incidentally to my pursuit of just more knowledge as a graduate student. So it was always my intent when I started law school that I would end up joining a faculty and becoming an academic. It just ended up taking a lot longer than I had expected. So I graduated law school in 1999, but I didn't start teaching until 2006. So I clerked for 2 years, then I was in private practice for 5 years. I learned a lot. I'm very happy, actually, that I spent time in private practice. It's the only time in my life that I had sustained engagement in the private sector. So I think I got a lot. I benefited a lot, not least of which is Sarah Lee was a client of mine at one point in time. That's how we sort of physically met. When she was the vice president at Goldman Sachs, I was staffed on a deal with her. But I think I don't regret having spent 5 years working in Wall Street. I learned a lot. I made a lot of friends. I have much better insight, I think, into the way finance works, and it's made me a better law teacher. I teach corporate law. I teach international business transactions. And so it was good, but it was much like Sarah said, it wasn't something that I wanted to do for the entirety of my life. I didn't want to look back when I was 65 and think that the only thing I had done was do a bunch of deals for Goldman Sachs. I have nothing against Goldman Sachs. I'm not sort of like, I'm not an ideological Marxist or anything like that, but it's not the kind of job you dream of as a kid. Like I say, nobody grows up dreaming to read a bond indenture. It just is not on anybody's radar screen. And so the work I do as an academic is much more meaningful to me. And significantly, it allows me to have a voice. When you work in private practice as a lawyer, just the nature of it, you can't really be have a persona because it alienates clients, et cetera, et cetera. And so you make trade-offs. You trade your persona for money. And it's not really a trade-off that I wanted to do for the entirety of my life.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo. Brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.